I'm Harold James from the program on European politics and society. It's great having everyone here for this discussion on what I think is an absolutely epochal election in Germany, an epochal election for Europe and for the world. And it's very, very closely intertwined, obviously, with the political developments in this country, in the sense that the coalition that ruled Germany and that hadn't really come to its full term of power from the four-year parliamentary election disintegrated the day that the election results in the United States became clear. So there was a very, very clear link between the disintegration of the so-called ample coalition, and I'm sure our panelists will explain what the ample coalition was, and then the events that led to the premature dissolution of the parliament, new elections on Sunday, and the election result that comes predictably because Germans are still, despite the stories about the infrastructure crumbling, they're still very, very efficient in producing election results very quickly and accurately. So I've got a wonderful panel to introduce to you, all with a Princeton affiliation at the moment. Three of them, obviously, you will recognize as permanently at Princeton. Markus Brunnermeier, an economist. Then we've got, doing it in alphabetical order, Rafaela Dancygier, a political scientist. Carolina Mezger from the University of Munich and the Institute for Contemporary History. But for this semester, we're very pleased to have her in the history department. So she's a historian who's worked extensively on the history of the Nazi period and on Germany and occupation in the Second World War. I really won't introduce the work of the other panelists, the Princeton panelists, because they're so well known that I would be here forever if I did that. And finally, Jan-Werner Müller, who I think you will all also recognize from many, many columns in The Guardian and the London Review of Books and Project Syndicate and so on. So this really wonderful panel. And the first question that I had was really a brief question to all the panelists. What happened on Sunday? Who won the election? And why did they win it? So Markus, if you would like to start, if we follow the alphabetical order.
So the first thing is, the voter turnout was very high. It actually was the highest since unification in Germany. So it was more than 80%, 83%. So these are some striking pictures, I would say. So if you compare the 2021 elections, which party got the main votes? The red ones are the Social Democrats, the black ones are the Conservatives, and the blue ones are the Alternative für Deutschland, so the right-wing party. What's shocking is you can see a clear divide, and you can see the borderline between the former GDR and the Federal Republic clearly showing up as well. So there's a clear majority in the East is with showing up. Of course, before that it was primarily in Saxony, but then it's now in the former GDR all over the place. Now, you might have, the first impressions you might get is you have some strengthening, everything shifting to the right. So, of course, the AfD won 10% extra votes, from 10% to more than 20%. And the Conservative, the CDU-CSU, won more than 4.4%. And also the CDU-CSU became actually shifted to the right to some extent too, because Merkel was on the left side of the CDU-CSU, and the Conservative Party became more conservative. But I think just looking at this, it would be misleading because essentially the win of the CDU-CSU was actually relative to the last elections. The last election, the CDU-CSU was particularly weak. They gained more than 4%, but they were particularly weak in 2021. And 2021 was also an election during Corona, and everything was, COVID dominated the whole debate, and was also was a strange election in this sense. And then you also have the left party, the Linke, won actually significantly this time around. They got easily into the parliament. There was always a question: will they get in the parliament? over the 5% hurdle. So in Germany, in order to get to the parliament, you have to have more than 5% of the votes, or you have 3 candidates in certain constituency, you're winning the majority in these districts. And they won easily. They got almost 9%, I think, this time around. And there was a new party from the former left party, Sarah Wagenknecht. She was always part of the left party. She split off and founded her own party, the BSW, Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht. And she almost got 5%. So she is not in the parliament, but it was very tight. It was not decided, actually. You had to wait until Monday morning almost to figure out whether she would be in the parliament as well. And if she would have entered the parliament, the majority to find a coalition, majority coalition would have been much more difficult. But overall, rather than it's essentially the extreme on the right and the left gained on popularity. So one thing I want to say, if you look at the young voters, what's very interesting is, and the young voters, actually, the AfD, the right, and the left are getting much, much more popularity compared to the general population. The one reason is they actually get less media coverage, so the public media is not covering them so well. So they're focused early on social media, and it's much more emotional, much more radicalizing. And so young voters flock essentially more to the extreme parties. And you can see this, here you can see the shift among the young and the old. So if you look at the Social Democrats, the red ones, the young have 12% just voting for the Social Democrats. And you can also see for the Conservatives only 13%. But you see a big dog coming from these are the right and the left, so the young actually tilting to that. What's also interesting, that's between young and old, but it's also a gender gap. So what you saw, if you go back in history, essentially there's no gender gap, so male and female behave the same way. So what's happening, mostly women go to the left and men go to the right. That is a huge gender gap, which is perhaps similar to other countries as well. But it's a huge disagreement between male and female, which direction we have. Just a few words. Of course, the coalition, which is the only feasible coalition, is between the Conservatives and the Social Democrats. The critical issues are rearmament, military, Ukraine support, given in the light what Trump is doing. The economics, part of the economics is a debt break, but it's much broader. It needs real disruption of the system to restart the economy. Germany was not growing the last 3 years. It's doing much worse than the rest of Europe. And then there's migration is a big issue as well, in order to contain essentially the AfD. Do something. I think that what will happen is that the leadership of the Social Democrats will change radically. So that's a big question. Who will take on the leadership roles? Of course, Boris Pistorius, the defense minister, will take an important role. He's a very popular politician in Germany. If he would have run for the Social Democrats, they might have done much better. And he might, the defense minister, take a more important role, I think, the disagreement about Ukraine support within the Social Democrats is very much in favor of supporting Ukraine. And Lars Klingbeil, who is one of the co-leaders of the Social Democrats, if this wing gets more influence in the Social Democrats and the coalition, it's probably much easier to handle. And overall, in all of these main areas, rearmament, economics, migration, I expect, and also the history of the Social Democrats is that they always think very much in favor of the country before they think about their party. So I cannot see that they actually will walk away from the negotiations for a new coalition. So overall, I'm quite optimistic that this is actually lead to a stable government. The weakness is that the extremes they can block any constitutional changes. So the 2/3 majority is lost for the middle party, the democratic parties. And in particular, if you want to change the debt break in a radical way, the extremes can block it. So the debt break will be in power. There's one option that the all parliament is still voting until, I think, March 20th, and makes a constitutional change to change the debt brake, but that's highly controversial. So to get away from the debt brake, particularly if you want to spend some huge military expansion, you need a constitutional change, most likely, and this will be much harder because the extreme left and extreme right, they're both more Russian friendly and they don't want to have a rearmament and put a lot of money in the militaries. So let me leave it at that.
The second worst election outcome since 1949, even though the government had a disapproval rating of 82%, Scholz had a disapproval rating of 70%, 72%. So it was really a very, very meager election outcome for the CDU. And one of the main goals that the CDU had set for itself was to reduce the appeal of the extremist far right. So not only to, of course, gain vote shares overall, but to make inroads with the AfD. And of course, that didn't happen. If it happened, maybe minimally, but it doesn't seem to be the case. It doesn't, from what we know now in terms of voter flows, it does not seem to be the case that the that the CDU recaptured AfD voters in significant numbers. And in part, this is due, some say, to sort of a big blunder that Merz, who's the leader of the CDU, committed before the election, and really not just one blunder, but in general the election campaign, which is one that conservative parties all over Europe actually constantly make, and that is to keep on talking about the topic that is feeding the success of far-right parties. So one of the topics, as I'm sure many of you know, that was very much in the headlines was immigration. As it should be, because it is an issue that it's cause for concern. There are certainly problems, but there's always the question of salience. How much do you talk about this particular issue versus other issues? And not only did Merz and others talk about this issue all the time, Merz in particular actually went to the Bundestag and had a very controversial vote with very extreme immigration positions, and he was only able to pass this with the support of the AfD. This was known ahead of time. This was not a surprise, and it was a big break of the norms in German post-war political history, because there was sort of an unspoken agreement that you do not pass votes that rely on the support of extremist parties. And so this is something that many voters didn't like, and it ended up being a miscalculation. It didn't seem to have helped him, because if you look at the election results, in some ways, yes, we should be very concerned that the AfD, an extremist party, in many ways, received 80% of the vote. But it's 20% of the vote. But it's also true that 80% of voters rejected it, right? So 80% of voters are actually committed to liberal democracy, even though among many of them, immigration was their top issue. And immigration and crime. Crime was often stated separately, but often people link that. And that's in line with when we look at historical polling. So when you look at people's views about liberal democracy, vast majorities in Germany, they believe in the protection of minority rights, separation of powers, freedom of the press, and so on, rule of law. They do not want a strong leader. Those are very clear majorities. And also, actually, majorities are in favor of having some migration. Are there issues? Absolutely, and these problems need to be dealt with. But it's not the case, media coverage to the contrary, that there's this upsurge of anti-immigrant opposition. And so the CDU is the big loser in my mind because A, it miscalculated, but B, we've actually known this for a very long time now. So speaking as a political scientist, as political scientists, there's sort of very few truths that we have, very few sort of empirical regularities. But one of them is that when centrist parties move to the right on immigration with the goal of recapturing voters from the far right, it often fails. Sometimes, maybe once out of 10 times it works, but for the most part, it fails. In fact, we've done studies on this after the last election in Germany. Actually, no, 2017, the one before, when the AfD really surged. And we really wanted to know, well, if you show voters politicians who propose immigration bans or reduced immigration, are voters going to prefer those politicians over centrist politicians over AfD candidates who also propose a ban? Like, in other words, do voters prefer the centrist alternative if they can get anti-immigration positions? And some do, and you can recapture some AfD voters by doing that. But you really turn off a lot of other centrist voters. And there's still a lot more centrist voters, thankfully, than there are extremist voters. And so this happens really time and time again, where these centrist parties are miscalculating. And moreover, what's really puzzling about it as well is there's sort of a consensus, even among people who are pro-immigration, that immigration policy is not working very well in many European countries. And yet, these parties are talking about it when they've been the incumbents all along. So they're actually highlighting an issue where they're not, it's not their strong issue, even among people who like immigration. And so they're really giving a gift to these extremist parties by increasing issue salience. Because one of the things that sort of this paradox that's been happening over the years is, social scientists will say, but look at these polls, people are still pro-immigrant. And then others say, well, how can this be when A, we hear about the opposite all the time, and B, these extremist parties are rising? Well, what's happened is that these views have actually remained quite stable, but the salience of the issue among voters who do not like immigration has really shot up. And so for that reason, people who don't like immigration and who really are drawn to the AfD and other parties like it because of immigration, they make that their priority, and others do not. And in fact, if you look at the most important issues for voters in this election, yes, immigration was an issue and crime, but it was it was interesting because there wasn't like one top issue. When most of the exit polls show it was kind of 20% this, 20% that. A lot of people said soziale Sicherheit, which means economic security. A lot of people said economic growth. A lot of people said Friedenssicherung, which means sort of making sure that there's peace. And yes, immigration mattered, and yes, crime mattered. But it's far from the case, and the media coverage now will tell you often something different. It's far from the case that this was the dominant issue. So to conclude, again, to answer Harold's question, to me, the CDU was the big loser because it really failed to shift the conversation, underperformed relative to expectations and to what was possible. And in fact, the exit polls, if they're correct, show that people who cared a lot about economic growth, they're the ones who migrated towards the CDU. So the new voters that the CDU got is mainly because of perceived economic competence. So if it had doubled down on that issue, maybe we would have seen a different outcome. Thank you.
So maybe I could just highlight a little bit of the tension between the first two presentations and then ask Carolina to try to resolve them. Rafaela told us that 80% of the voters expressed their commitment to liberal democracy. But Markus's slide and presentation really showed the polarization on the left as well. And so whether the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht and Die Linken are really committed to liberal democracy, they're very, very close to the AfD on issues like supporting the Russian dictator, and also in terms of their position on migration. So it looks very, very different. They're also really going to be a very big obstacle in terms of reforming the debt brake. So we should think, and that obviously makes me think of history, because I also am somebody who studied the Weimar Republic extensively. The story of Weimar is the story of the collapse of the political middle, and the big parties shrinking and shrinking, the Center Party, the predecessor of the Christian Democrats, shrinking, the Social Democrats shrinking, the Liberal parties disappearing, and then the country becoming ungovernable because of the incompatible positions on right and left. And the other thing that looks historical, and Markus already pointed to that, is that this electoral map is so precisely the map of the division between old Federal Republic and old Democratic Republic, old East and West Germany, that it looks tempting to think again here that there's a revenge of history coming in here. So, Carolina, I think we need a historian on this.
As Harold kindly contextualized, I am a historian who has spent more or less the past 10 years of her life working in Germany alongside historians who have dedicated their lives to fighting, basically, right-wing populist ideologies, National Socialist views. And in that light, my evaluation of the recent election results are, I would say, much more devastating. I'm much more pessimistic than my colleagues on this panel. I don't think we need to draw direct parallels, let's say, to the Weimar Republic, and I can unpack that a little further later if you would like that. But basically, I would see the AfD as the clear winner, absolutely, of this election. They doubled their numbers and have become the second force in German federal politics. And the big loser, of course, also numerically, is the SPD, the Social Democrats, who have basically gained the fewest votes in their post-war history. So this is essentially an attack, a decline on social democracy. Now, I have several reasons to be pessimistic, essentially. And this is also largely related to this debate that has been going on in the German politics about this firewall against working in collaboration with the AfD to do politics, which also related to this blunder that you were talking about when Merz a few weeks ago decided essentially to push an anti-migration agenda through parliament with the help of the AfD. So that was the scandal. And I would say there are 3 points that worry me. First of all, I think when you look on the smaller communal level, I mean, the AfD, especially in East Germany, has been very powerful for a number of years and have held a third and more of the seats in these local Gemeinden. And so I think on the local level, what you see is much more of a cooperation, in fact, with the AfD already of the centrist parties, just by the sheer, I suppose, necessity to bring about certain policies. And I suppose also in certain districts, less of an aversion, I think, to doing politics with the AfD in general. I think along with that, what we've seen in the past years has been a very problematic drift towards the right of the CDU, CSU. And I think this speaks in part to Merz's blunder, as you call it, but I would say it goes much deeper. Well, I am based in Munich. I've lived in Bavaria for the last 8 years. And there, of course, it's not the CDU, it's the CSU, which is the basic governing party, right? So the CSU, CDU on a federal level is sort of this combined force. Now, Bavaria is currently being led, of course, by Markus K. And his vice is also the finance minister of Bavaria, Aiwanger. And there was a scandal surrounding him in August 2023, as many of you might be aware, where basically it surfaced that as a teenager, he had written up and circulated among his peers a massively anti-Semitic pamphlet, basically making jokes about sending Jews up the chimneys of Auschwitz. Now, I would say, maybe I'm mistaken, but perhaps 15, 20 years ago, this would have meant the death of a politician's career in Germany. So what happened? Söder made a very perfunctory investigation into the affair, concluded this would be no problem. In fact, this could help him politically, stuck to Aiwanger, and 6 weeks later in the Bavarian elections, the Freie Wähler, of which Aiwanger is the head, received their largest success in recent history. I think this feeds into sort of right-wing, anti-migration, xenophobic, but also anti-Semitic tendencies that we see in Germany in general. So especially after the October 7 attacks, there has been, I think, a massive increase in at least anti-Semitic rhetoric, to the point where even our own apartment building in Munich was defaced by anti-Semitic graffiti, and our own super refused to remove it. So I literally went with paint myself to remove this graffiti. And I think, in a sense, the CDU-CSU, what is supposed to be the center, is pandering more and more towards these sentiments. And I think this basically, brings me to this last point, essentially, which is that, I mean, what is supposed to be sort of a center-right party is going more and more towards this radical right. And if you compare political programs of this election and the 2021 election, what you see, especially on issues like migration, is basically an adoption by the CDU-CSU of former AfD talking points and opinions about, for instance, the mass deportation of foreigners. So this is how far I'll go for now, but I'm happy to speak more about certain historic parallels as well.
A statement there that the AfD is the real winner of this election, and that's obviously had an echo in the sense that big political figures outside Germany congratulated Alice Weidel and didn't congratulate Friedrich Merz. So the Prime Minister of Hungary did that. Elon Musk did that. It's an interesting moment in that sense that there's also a pressure from both Russia and the United States to move in a certain direction, and very, very definitively in both cases to support the AfD from the representatives of the US government. I mean, obviously not from Americans as a whole. Jan-Werner, it's wonderful to have you here. I wonder whether you might reflect on this, and also, I mean, the issue that has already been raised about the Brandmauer and the difficulty of this, in the sense that if you really stick to the Brandmauer, and Carolina mentioned this specifically in terms of local politics, how on earth do you deal with East Germany? Because East Germany looks as if it's going in a completely different direction. So this is really an enormous problem for a country that thinks of itself as a democracy. Jan-Werner.
I thought the unofficial title of this panel was going to be The Decline of the West. The actual unofficial title is Everything Has Been Said, but Not Everybody Has Said It. So I can entirely sign off on what Rafaela and Carolina just said. I would maybe add 2 points. One is that, to put it very bluntly, maybe Friedrich Merz is just not a very good politician. Some of you may remember that he ran for the leadership of the Christian Democrats many, many times. He was outmaneuvered by Angela Merkel very successfully more than 2 decades ago. Everybody said, if you want to win this election, make it about the economy, keep asylum policy out of it. And by the way, maybe pedantic, but I think it's about asylum policies. Germany is not an immigration-friendly country. Yes, Merkel let in a lot of people, but we are not generally an open country. This was specifically about people who claim asylum. But as my predecessors have already explained, he basically exactly does the wrong thing. One result we already discussed. So instead of weakening the far right, he strengthens the far right. And maybe less obviously, he also did something that massively benefited the left party. Up until that decision, it didn't look like they were going to enter the parliament. All of a sudden, there's a massive shift from young progressives in big cities who normally probably would have voted Green still, despite dissatisfaction with the governing coalition. And they say, what we absolutely don't want is to bring Merz to power. Because if Merz comes to power, it might somehow in the end mean cooperation with the radical right. So all of a sudden, massive number of young people shift to the left party. And that you can, if you look at the data, it's very clear. It's only because of this decision. Having said that, it's maybe also worth thinking about that to some degree. What happened here looks a little bit like what happened, for many people very unexpected, in France last year. Remember that all of a sudden there was something called the New Popular Front. Now, I don't want to idealize that. I'm certainly not a fan of Mélenchon, but I think it's an interesting lesson maybe that this front, on the one hand, was very clearly the anti-fascist front. At the same time, they also said it's not enough always to say Le Pen is dangerous. You have to say something more. So they also doubled down on very concrete policy issues. They talked a lot about housing. And the left in Germany did something somewhat similar. We don't know this for sure at this point, but I could imagine that some people also said, wait a minute, yes, I'm against the far right, but come to think of it, they actually also have things to say, which I, as a young person who can't afford an apartment in Berlin anymore, find quite attractive. So I think this is sort of not at the center maybe of a story about winners and losers, but it's also not trivial that this shift happened. And obviously it depends on what will happen next. But to go back to Merz, what he also made sure is that now the left party and the AfD have enough votes in the parliament such that he cannot do certain things, which, and Markus alluded to this already, he might not be able to do something about the debt brake. He also cannot easily raise military expenditures. Had the Greens been better, and the Greens have been the most pro-Ukraine party in many ways, the outcome would have been very different. So he did two things at the same time that ultimately were very harmful for his own agenda. One last footnote, if I may, because Harold kind of, in a sense, invited us to talk about this as well. I would somewhat shy away from suggesting a certain left-right symmetry here, or the old horseshoe theory that eventually, left totalitarians, right totalitarians meet with the same policies. I agree that Sarah Wagenknecht's party is a dangerous party. In fact, when you come to think about it, a party that names itself after the leader, must be a very democratic outfit. And she has proven what everybody feared, that she was basically going to run this like a personality cult, might remind you of other parties in other parts of the world. So I think it's a very good thing that they're not in the parliament. With the left party, I think it's more complicated. Yes, you can say that it's very dangerous, that they still want to get out of NATO, but wanting to be in NATO is not the same as do you want to be in favor of liberal democracy. And so maybe as a more general point, if I may, I think we should be somewhat more careful with these suggestions of symmetry. I'm old enough to remember many centrists saying, oh, Trump is bad, but the woke left is also really dangerous. I think all those people might take a few minutes to think about their political judgment in terms of what they really are suggesting and who's really dangerous and who might not be. Thanks.
Of issues that have been raised as being absolutely crucial for the outcome of the election, we've just heard them really. I think they were already in the opening presentation that Markus had. One, migration. Two, the economy, because Germany is in this big economic slowdown and looks as if it's the worst performing of the industrial economies. It sometimes competes a bit with the UK on this one. But it's really hit by this famous triple constellation. It's a big export economy. It's hit by the US turn towards tariffs and the threat of more tariffs. It's hit by the Russian gas problem, by not wanting to be dependent anymore on Russian gas, and it's hit by the China turning away from importing as well, and China slowing down. So the economy is in a problem. And finally, the foreign policy issue, and it does seem to me, I really strongly differ from Jan-Werner on this, that supporting NATO at the moment is essential to supporting liberal democracy in Europe and in the world, or thinking of a good alternative to NATO. And that's a possibility. And it's raised exactly by Friedrich Merz on Sunday evening, that you can't rely on NATO anymore. But if you want to defend liberal democracy, you need something like NATO. And can that be done by Europeans? They're trying to put that together at this moment. So the question of the balance between migration policy, foreign policy, and economic policy, I think, is a critical one. One additional item that I think you might think about is the linkage between Germany's historical commitment to fight anti-Semitism and the reactions immediately after October the 7th on the streets of German cities. I was in Berlin at that time, with large numbers of people celebrating October the 7th as an attack on Jews and an attack on the State of Israel. So that also, I think, is linked to the discussion of migration. So I think there are many issues that are actually still on the table and that need to be addressed. So maybe we go in the same order again, briefly.
Okay, thanks a lot, Harold, and thanks to all of you. I have, to some aspects, a different take on it. So let me just say something about Friedrich Merz. In my take is that he has a deep dislike towards the AfD. You can feel it in the body language if you just watch him, and he always talks very, opposition. I don't see that he will actively collaborate with them. I would be very, very surprised. And about his strategic move to make this one vote, the hope was that the Green Party and the SPD would vote with him to get something done. I think what the population is tired of inaction towards the migration. And the salience came not from the politicians. The salience came from the attacks. There was an attack in Magdeburg killing people. There was an attack in Schaffenburg. There was an attack in Munich. And it was constantly on the news because people were attacked and died. And that's what made it very, very salient. There was no way to get around that. This topic was in the front. And I know a lot of people who wanted to make the economic aspect really the key center. It was impossible. You couldn't penetrate anything through by talking about the economy. It was mostly because of migration and because these attacks drew all the attention. Now, if you look at when Merz did this supposedly blunder, you could look at the vote polls, how it changed, and it didn't move much. It was flat. It was around 30%. It was around 30%. It didn't move. So every day you could look at it, whether it changed the voting. The polls didn't change. What happened, there were some shifts inside, the numbers, but the total numbers in total didn't change. So one could argue it was a blunder exposed, given the outcome, that the CDU-CSU put this forward, and only the AfD was then voting with the CDU-CSU without having ever talked and coordinated with them. A better alternative would have been that the Social Democrats and the Green Party would have supported that initiative as well, but they didn't want it at that time for strategic reasons, in my view. Now, concerning the Left Party, I think the Left Party was very clever, and I agree to some extent that some of the people went to the Left Party. They made, I think, a very clever move. So they are focused very much on rent control. So one big issue in Germany is that the rents the costs and inflation is going. So inflation, rent control, that was what they're focused on. And they primarily drew on the young people because their party leader, one of the co-leaders, is Heidi, forgot her last name. She is a very important TikTok influencer. So she became the party leader, and she is very attractive for young voters, and she was very successful in this dimension. I agree that there's more anti-Semitic parts coming up, also, with the tension in the Middle East. But that's primarily coming, from the AfD and also from the left, and immigration doesn't help in this regard. So we have more severe problems on this side. So that's, I think, the core, the center parties, they are very, very they are very, very against anti-Semitic behavior. I think it comes really from the extreme sides.
I think on the salience, it's of course true that there were a lot of attacks just before the election, and that made it hard to talk about other things. But it's also true that in the years preceding this, in the years preceding these attacks, you had Olaf Scholz, who's supposedly of the Social Democrats, on the cover of the Spiegel, saying Abschiebung im großen Stil, deportation in large-scale deportations. So for a long time now, even before the last few weeks of the election, the centrist parties, and again, Germany isn't alone in this, are just not getting the message that, yes, they have to talk about immigration, but they can do so in a competent way, and they don't have to parrot the far-right slogans. And I think this is sort of the issue. It's also true, as you said, the polls didn't change for Merz, but that's precisely the blunder, because he tried to recapture some AfD voters, or voters who care about immigration, or non-voters, right, to the CDU. But the exit polls showed is that the non-voters who were mobilized into the election, they mainly went to, or many of them went to the AfD. So the AfD benefited most from non-voters. So in that sense, it was just sort of something that just didn't work. And the optimism versus pessimism. So I'm actually not optimistic, but I'm not pessimistic because I think voters are terrible and are so fascist and supportive of extremism. Of course, that exists, and in much of my research, actually, those are the voters I focus on. But I'm pessimistic because the elites don't get it. The elites are facilitating the normalization of the extremism, and the elites, time and time again, they look to the extremes, the centrist elites, to make inroads rather than proposing in really strong terms a counter program. And so that's why I'm pessimistic, not because I think it's inevitable that all the extremism will bubble up from the bottom and spread. I think it's because elites are just facilitating this spread in very important ways. So I'm pessimistic for that reason.
Okay, I would like to agree with you actually on this, and I think that's one of the major dangers of having the AfD be already at basically 20% on a federal level, which is that the AfD has consistently sort of extended not just what is thinkable, but what is sayable. And sayable in a supposedly sort of mainstream setting, like the German parliament or the mainstream media. And this has drifted more and more towards the radical right. And I think you're absolutely right that it's here also in the responsibility of politicians to sort of draw certain lines also rhetorically and not embrace something like this dreadful remigration. So this new word they coined to avoid the word deportation, which in German has, very different connotations that are directly related to the Holocaust, essentially. I also sort of, tying back into, I suppose, my experiences living in Munich, sort of one of my acquaintances, she's working basically for the city of Munich in a project that is essentially helping migrant women to find jobs, build a career, and so on. So basically technical training, language training, and so on and so forth. So she's very much at the front lines, so to speak, of the day-to-day meanings of what is it to be in a society with a large proportion and an increasing proportion of migrants that don't look like you, that don't speak like you, and so on. And she used this fantastic word, Migrantisierung. So German is very flexible in how you coin new terms. And she said basically she's tired of having everything turned into a question of migration. And I think you were sort of getting at that too. I mean, it's absolutely clear that German infrastructure is crumbling, in fact. So anyone who's lived in Germany over the past 20 years, they know that if you take the Deutsche Bahn, in most cases, you won't get where you need to go. School, education, the health system, everything has become quite difficult, right? And instead of addressing issues like that, fundamental issues, with, for instance, more programs aimed at the sort of integration of migrants into professions in healthcare, in education, where people are needed so desperately, they've decided to turn this into basically a rhetoric of hate and exclusion. So personally, that is where I see the problem. And in fact, I think if you look, I think not just in Germany, right? I think in other sort of industrial or sort of post-industrial countries, in fact, sort of lack of sufficient healthcare, lack of sufficient education, and so on and so forth is often fixed, in a sense, through migration, and in Germany as well.
So 3 quick points. Harold, you and I don't disagree about the importance of NATO. My point was simply one from a pedantic political theorist who says, well, the question of democracy and the question of NATO are 2 different matters. Not every founding member of NATO was a democracy. Not every current member of NATO happens to be a democracy. And what the left is saying might be in terrible political judgment, I think it is, but it's not conclusive evidence that somehow it's not a democratic party in the way that if you look at Wagenknecht's party and the internal structures, I think it's very clear that it's not really a democratic party. Second point, some observers, I think, have read the whole election outcome as fitting into the by now entirely cliched frame of, oh, it's a populist wave that is, washing across Europe. And some of you may have read the important book by our former colleague Larry Bartels. The book is called Democracy Erodes from the Top, where he says, no, that's a misconception. It's not true that millions of people wake up one fine morning and say, hey, today I want to vote for the radical right. What is much more plausible is the process we've already heard about from our colleagues, the center-right legitimating the far-right, but also the far-right attracting people who hadn't voted before. Now, we can have a debate about this, again, from a normative democratic theory point of view, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. But that also has been very evident here. 2 million people who had not voted before came out for the AfD. And, maybe bad news, actually pretty much bad news, majorities of voters of the radical right now say we're doing it out of conviction. So the story, which was, oh, it's protest, they're so dissatisfied, etc. This is, to quote our colleague Michael Moore, this is the biggest fuck you that you can possibly utter. That is empirically not true at this point. But even worse, in a sense, unlike so many other far-right European parties, Le Pen is the obvious example, the AfD has not in any way tried to moderate. There is no de-demonization. They wear their historical revisionism, as openly as one can. I mean, if you look at some of the people who just now entered the parliament, it's horrendous. What they've done, what they've said, who they were connected to, etc. So that, in a sense, makes it actually the exception in the European context as well, in a certain way. And of course, there's a big question for us as you can tell by now, as political scientists, we're already totally failing because we have been saying for 2 decades, don't legitimate the far right. They keep doing it anyway. Nobody listens to us. But there's also a real puzzle for us because you have to explain how come that these guys are radicalizing so much in a country where, elites spend decades and decades lecturing the rest of the world. This is how you come to terms with your past. This is, how you do these things properly. In a country like that, you get away with this amount of, as I said, historical revisionism. One last point, maybe, because Harold also asked us about this beforehand. It's too early to tell. I don't think we have sort of enough data to say much about this. From what I've seen, it doesn't look like Elon Musk coming out for the radical right made a huge difference. Maybe it did in the end, but that didn't seem to be a sort of important moment. Musk, you'll be shocked to hear, is actually not very popular in Europe. So also in the UK, it's not like majorities say, yeah, great, let's have him fix it, for us. So that doesn't seem to be such a huge factor. But of course, there's a much bigger question about what may have happened or not have happened on his platform. You may have, read some of these things by whistleblowers who said, of course, we've been manipulating the whole thing. Whether that can be taken at face value, who knows? It's an interesting observation. Last thing I'll say, that, of course, by now, many, many institutions in Europe, especially universities, have left his platform and have said, we cannot, under any circumstances, keep using this as a means of communication. Many politicians have not. Many universities in this country also have not. But maybe that's another issue to perhaps raise on another day.
Thanks. Can I inject another line of discussion into this, and then we'll open up to the big audience. Most of this discussion is very, very German focused. So it's the particular responsibility of German history. It's the particular legacy of the electoral system. It's the particular legacy of the GDR. But if you think of an issue like migration, it's really impossible to think of it without thinking of a European context, in the sense that Germany, after all, is a country that has no boundaries, no borders with countries that are not part of either the EU or the Schengen area. So they have the controls that they should go through. And so, thinking about how you deal with the question of illegal immigration, and I think that is really a big question that every government has to face, can only really be dealt with in a European sense. And that's why I think this discussion about the vote was so important. Is this compatible with EU law, or is it not compatible with EU law? But it needs to be done on a European level. But I think the clearer issue is also the defense issue, that you need to think about this in terms of a European context, and Germany needs to deal with the politics of other European countries, with France, with Italy, with smaller countries, with the Nordics, with Poland. How's Germany going to do this?
Yeah, let me go to the European issues. So I think, as Merz indicated, he will focus very much on Europe. And he was very much, as you probably know, he was the boss of BlackRock in Germany beforehand, when he was kicked out, outmaneuvered by Angela Merkel. And then before he came back to politics. He was very much a transatlantic person, but he said on Sunday night he would have never imagined 2 years to say that he cannot rely on the United States anymore and Europe has to build up its own thing. So I expect sharp moves in terms of rearmament. I expect a very, very focused European focus coming from Merz and the party generally. There will be unification on the military side. I don't see it happening within the European Union. I see it happening as a new formation, including United Kingdom, because you need essentially the coordination with the United Kingdom as well, which is outside of the European Union. But there will be big changes coming up. And Merz will also, supposedly is only running this time. He's not running a second time around. That's at least the plan. So he wants to make changes. He's not concerned about being elected again. But of course, the parties have to be very concerned to contain the AfD. And that's one of the main tasks. And as I said earlier, the sense is just inaction and not doing anything on the migration is just making the AfD stronger and stronger. So you have to show that you solve the problem, what people care about. And of course, they care about migration. Of course, perhaps there might have been too much emphasis on it. I don't think it's hard to... I think it's very hard to avoid the topic given what's happening on the ground. But of course, the economic situation is equally dire. So there is a huge shift possible. As Harold mentioned before, the old business model, getting cheap energy from Russia, selling your products to China, and getting cheap security provision from the United States, this business model doesn't work anymore. So it has to be a radical change, and people are aware of it, and they will move this way. And it has to be a big disruptive change at the moment, and I think it's coming. And I think the new government is aware of it. And watching on Sunday night, there was a Berliner Runde. It was very informative how the centrist parties were all thinking the same way. And when Scholz was arguing, do we want to have troops on the ground in Ukraine? Then Scholz said, no, this has to be step number 4. And Merz immediately agreed. So there was a broad agreement among the Social Democrats, the CDU-CSU, and also the Green Party to some extent. To a large extent, I would say. And that was very striking. And I think this support, of course, they don't have the 2/3 majority anymore. That's a handicap. But I'm more optimistic. But in general, I'm an optimistic guy. So I'm hopeful this will work out. And we only have a 1-year chance because the next state elections will come pretty soon. So this next year will be very decisive.
Yeah, on the question about the EU, I agree with you, what you said. And one interesting thing to watch also will be the AfD's role within the EU, because a lot of far-right parties in the EU don't actually like the AfD all that much because the AfD is further to the right than a lot of those other parties. And they've even kicked them out of a grouping because one of the big goals of the radical right is to seem respectable. And there are too many within the AfD who sort of cause problems on that front. So it's going to be really interesting to see that dynamic play out. And it could also be, I mean, this is purely speculative, because people say, how can it be that the AfD is so strong with the Brandmauer and so on, and with having radicalized so much? Some people definitely like the radicalized positions, but it could also be that precisely because there is this firewall where other parties say they're not going to go into coalition, that's what's prevented it from moderating. Now, I'm not making an argument against the firewall. I'm clearly not. But it's also this interesting phenomenon that if you compare across other European countries, there's really not an attempt within the AfD to look to moderate. I mean, they've just gone the other way, and that's a different scenario than in some other European countries. And so then at the European level, it's just going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
I would basically agree with you too on this point. And I think, I suppose, some optimistic points about these election results, I think relate to, the strong European agenda of the major coalition partners, or I suppose as they will be defined. And also, I think the very strong commitment to supporting Ukraine. I don't see that dissolving anytime soon. And I think, in fact, as far as I understand, the current government is currently trying to find, for instance, an exception to the the Schuldenbremse for continued support for Ukraine, essentially. So that's one stance where they've been, I think, very consistent, whether it's CSU, CDU, SPD, and so on. And I think that's one part, indeed, where I won't see any cooperation with the AfD anytime soon.
I'll try to say something positive about Merz for a change. So he clearly is culturally, politically a sort of son of the old West Germany, which means he does have these transatlantic instincts. I think he also has an almost instinctive understanding for how France matters. In general, the latter has been disappearing from German political culture. There was a time when, almost instinctively people said, okay, before we do anything, you have to first call Paris. And that is no longer the case. The only thing is, of course, if you now call Paris, who's on the other line? Well, a very, very weakened French president. So if you think that Europe can't get anything done unless there is a strong Franco-German partnership, I think that means it's bad news. There might be some alternatives. So he might turn to Tusk and say, look, we agree on a lot of issues. An experienced, strong leader to the east. But as everybody by now knows, Moscow has its agents inside the EU and in certain capitals as well. And that's going to be an epic struggle in terms of what do you do with the Fizos and the Orbans in terms of, working out something that really might be in a dimension which none of us could have imagined a couple of months ago.
So thanks. I think we've had a very good discussion here. Some questions? Yes, please. Let me bring you a microphone. Is it on?
Thank you so much to all of you. It was very insightful. Without trivializing the changes that have happened, I just have a quick question on how far right the AfD can go, especially I'm talking because of the experiences of the Swiss People's Party, the SVP, which inspires Alice Weidel a lot, and apparently she stays in Switzerland. So there have been a majority party in Switzerland since 2014, been very active like the AfD since 2007. So are they not playing up until they look like SVP in Switzerland? Or do you think they could even push further to the right? Thank you.
Well, despite living in Munich, Carolina is a Swiss national, as I understand it. So I think that Carolina should answer that question about the...
Well, I naturalized as a Swiss last year, also under the SVP, so I'm just want to know how far they can go.
So the SVP is a model.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so first of all, congratulations on your naturalization. It's great to have another Swiss in the room. So I'm actually... from Switzerland originally. And I would say the SVP has always been a very large sort of blanket organization for everything from sort of a more moderate centrist position to the very hard right? So there's no need, so to speak, for an AfD in Switzerland because there's the SVP and its right-wing branches. I think your question in terms of how far right can the AfD go, I mean, I think we've seen that certainly on a more sort of local level in Thüringen especially. So, the AfD has for years been under strict surveillance and observation by basically the domestic German Secret Service. And several branches of that have been identified as being decidedly right-wing radical. I mean, to the point where their ideology is anti-constitutional and they reject the federal state. So there's a very strong neo-Nazi force in the AfD already. And I suppose the question is how much of that will bleed into Berlin and more sort of mainstream politics.
Andy Muravchik.
Great presentation. I felt like we talked a little bit around what the positive issue-based reasons are why people are voting for the AfD. So to take the big three you looked at, it doesn't seem like there's a huge number of Germans who say we want a much softer Ukraine policy than one we've got. It seems like, as Rafaela pointed out, everybody's talking about immigration, and maybe people care about that, but it doesn't seem to be an explanation in and of itself. And on economics, you might think, when you look at the map, you might think, well, the AfD is a party a little bit like the Poles and the Hungarians, which are actually pretty redistributive in some of their economic policies. So people are voting their economic discontent. But when you look at the tax proposals of the AfD in this election, they were the most pro-rich policies of any party by a lot. So I'm wondering if there's any issue-based reason why people are voting for the AfD, and if so, what is it?
I mean, it's immigration.
You should also add, I think, to that list. I mean, something that we oddly haven't discussed at all is an energy policy. So at one point, the big issue that the AfD put on was about phasing out diesel cars. Currently, one of the protests that is very effective is about high energy prices. So we talked about high rents, but high energy prices are a big thing, and they're connected also, obviously, to the war with Ukraine, with the war in Ukraine. So maybe put energy prices into this mixture.
But here we have, this is actually one issue where social scientists are, we have clear answers. It is immigration. So not only is that by far the top issue among AfD voters, they also say it's the party with by far the highest competence. So that would be probably 2/3 of AfD voters. Then you throw in some protest voters, some COVID. COVID also caused a lot of disillusionment among many voters, including AfD voters. But it's not. I'm not going to say it's a one-issue party, but it is, empirically speaking, that every survey will show this. That if you're very frustrated about immigration, you're going to most likely vote for the AfD. And moreover, if you look at the AfD's electorate, almost all of them list immigration as their top issue. And they think the AfD is competent here.
Maybe one pedantic addition. Many of the other parties are extremely weak on the ground in the former East Germany. And the AfD has become much stronger on the ground, often with very unclear financing. I'm not officially saying Russia, but I'm kind of saying Russia. So that also makes a difference, just in terms of the presence that they have, and how it's become sort of a, as we know from, again, many of our colleagues in political science, it's, I'm part of this group, everybody around me now thinks like this and votes like this, and this has become totally normalized. So it's not necessarily that, people, again, wake up one day and sort of think it all through and say, now, in the program is exactly what I want. But it's an important point about this is the pro-rich party. So all these stories about, it's all the losers of globalization and so on, plus it seems there has not been any movement of voters from the Social Democrats to the AfD, which is the other conventional story that, it's the left party is losing. Seems that has not happened on this occasion.
It is true to say that the SPD has largely lost the vote of the working class, though. That's a very, very notable phenomenon that's been taking place over a long time. The SPD has become a different kind of party, and it's a middle-class intellectual party. Sophie.
So thank you, first of all, for a great panel. To follow up on the discussion here, I understand the election was about immigration and the economy was in the background, but can you tell us a little bit about the economic cleavages that exist between the different parties? And for instance, on issues such as industrial policy, where do they stand on that? Where do they stand on the engagement with China? Because this is an area where Germany has been a little bit different from some of the other members of the European Union when it comes to electric vehicles, for instance, subsidies for electric vehicles, or in general investment coming from China, or German investment going abroad to China. So where do the different parties stand on that?
Yeah, perhaps I can. So there's, of course, as came up already, the AfD is essentially getting rid of all the environmental regulations which were put in place in the last 10 years, and this way reducing energy prices. That's a big deal for them. In terms of industrial policy, I would say there were quite some attempts. So the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States caused a huge movement also in Europe. So we should do something similar, and let's do that. The current government essentially put huge subsidies out for Intel and other big and battery power companies to produce batteries. And most of these subsidies didn't work out. So some of the companies went bankrupt, others withdrew. And it was seen as a failure in terms of industrial policy. This was very dirigist. So the Habeck was in the economy ministry. He was very dirigist in terms of interventionist. And so the Social Democrats and the Greens would be, much more from top down, while the conservatives and also the liberals who did not make it into parliament anymore, we should have said this too, they are much more from the roots bottom up. So to have a common framework and let then the industries win. So we don't do very concrete industrial policy. I would say the liberals on the extreme side. The conservatives are a little bit mixed, so they do some industrial policy. You look at Bavaria, there's quite some industrial policy going on, but not to the same extent as I was, following the Inflation Reduction Act. I think there are different attitudes. With Friedrich Merz, I think it will be much more on the liberal side, libertarian side in a sense, not liberal in the US sense. Where there will be less interventions and there will be, rather have investment subsidies across the board rather than we subsidize particular industries or particular firms. Of course, this opens up to lobbying and other complications as well. Once you could see it immediately in the German industry when the government said, okay, we will do some similar subsidy schemes. The industry was lining up, and typically it helps the big industries. It hurts smaller firms, medium-sized firms, because they don't have the same lobbying power. So that's on the economic side.
Well, thank you. That was an extraordinarily helpful and interesting discussion, and I think we went through a number of the big issues. There's no complete agreement on the panel. There's some optimism, particularly in thinking about the European framework. There's some pessimism, obviously, in terms of thinking about this big area of blue and what that means for the future of democracy and what it means for the future of being able to have a free and open and liberal society. So we've presented the issues. We've got to work out what answers the Germans provide for that and what answers Europeans can provide for that as well. So thank you so much for being here. And